The towers of Coruscant pierced the clouds like the bones of ancient titans, lit beneath by rivers of traffic and distant promises. Among spires of transparisteel and durasteel, a flickering flame remained trapped in glass, a quiet symbol resting beneath the weight of politics and pretense. It trembled with each whispered lie, each sanctioned secret, waiting for the breath that would feed it. Inside the grand convocation chamber, debate echoed not with clarity, but with pageantry. Senators drifted on repulsor-lift platforms like drifting ash, their voices sharp with self-interest and procedural guise. Behind layers of legal language and diplomatic illusion, the Senate splintered. Chancellor Palpatine listened with the calm of one accustomed to silence. Power gathered at his fingertips without resistance. Few remembered what the Republic once meant. Fewer still recognized its bones beneath the gilded rot. Systems in the mid and outer rims, once loyal, turned distant. Their messages grew colder. The Trade Federation, Techno Union, and Banking Clan aligned their interests not with ideals, but with ledgers and leverage. Armament began in quiet. Foundries lit without announcement. Droids assembled without oversight. All was done legally, if one read the laws slowly enough. Far below the marble chambers, Coruscant's underlevels pulsed with another rhythm. Alleyways thick with shadow became circuits for forgotten names. In the haze of old neon and shifting loyalties, the name Dooku returned, spoken with a mix of reverence and fear. A former Jedi, now vanished. No longer servant of the Council, but voice of another vision. He offered discontent wrapped in conviction. In the cracks of civilization, orders were exchanged. Holocrons passed in silence. Shipments rerouted. Allegiances redrawn. On distant worlds, trust in the Republic dissolved grain by grain. Protection was promised and withheld. Peacekeepers arrived only after damage was done. In their absence, separatist murmurs grew louder. Those with power armed themselves. Those without turned to shadows. Within the temple, the Jedi felt the change, but named it poorly. The Force, once a current that flowed gently through all things, became a haze. Visions fragmented. The Council met often, spoke carefully, and listened rarely. Yoda offered calm, Mace Windu sought clarity, but both watched the horizon with caution. Their roles shifted. Diplomacy gave way to policing. Negotiation gave way to strategy. Without formal decree, the Jedi Order stepped closer to war. In training halls, younglings sparred as they always had. In meditation chambers, Padawans struggled to find stillness. Yet beneath every lesson hummed uncertainty. The Jedi were no longer guardians above politics. They were being drawn into it, line by line, assignment by assignment. The people of Coruscant's lower levels saw things differently. They measured peace not in treaties, but in nights without explosions. They did not debate Senate bills. They counted missing neighbors. Jedi ships flew overhead but rarely landed. Hope dimmed in places the Jedi had never walked. In one unmarked warehouse, far from the temple's spires, crates arrived in silence. Inside, armor, not yet worn, helmets stacked without insignia, rifles lined in rows. These were not for parade. There was no press release. Yet preparations had begun, far from the floor of any chamber. The flame inside the vial began to quiver. Palpatine's hand never hovered near a weapon, yet each emergency bolstered his authority. Every plea for protection granted him greater reach. Senators spoke of stability. What they enabled was control. What passed through their votes was not order, but quiet consent to shadows thickening. In his private office, the Chancellor kept the small vial on his desk, a gift from Naboo, once called a symbol of peace. It flickered faintly now. He would glance at it between authorizations. The light danced in his eyes, but cast no warmth. The galaxy shifted. Ships moved with purpose. Encrypted messages disappeared before they could be traced. Jedi archives logged more missions. Jedi returned with more questions. The war had not begun, but its shape had formed. No one would name it yet. No one would see its edge until it passed through them. The flame dances, unseen, as armies gather in silence. Copper light pressed down like judgment. Across the red world of Geonosis, the surface split into jagged canyons and rusted valleys, barren only to eyes that did not see beneath. Below, machines never slept. Foundries and furnaces churned without pause, casting sparks into the dark as lines of droids emerged with mechanical precision. There was no anthem to this labor. No cries of freedom echoed in the tunnels. Instead, the separatist cause took shape through conveyor belts and neural chips, built not on hope, but repetition. Overseers moved silently, their insectoid eyes fixed only on production. Here, rebellion was measured by how many units could be deployed before dawn. Above, an arena carved from stone and ego loomed over the dusty plain. Once a site of spectacle, now a stage for something irreversible. Obi-Wan Kenobi, shackled and bloodied, waited with eyes unflinching. Padme Amidala stood beside him, her presence a refusal to bow. Anakin Skywalker, young and unyielding, strained against his bonds like a storm denied. No court presided. This was not trial, but theater. When beasts were released into the arena, the sands shifted beneath roars and clawed fury. But before the sentence could be completed, the sky shattered with color. Sabers ignited in arcs of green and blue, Jedi dropping into the melee like bolts of defiance. They came not in formation, but in conviction. The Order had not meant to start a war, but in that instant, it was done. Gunships swept over the cliffs, wind howling in their wake. Clone troopers disembarked in lines, their armor still unscarred by experience. They moved with unity no one had expected. Camino had bred them to obey, and obey they did, with speed, with focus, with silence. Dust thickened. Blaster fire scorched the ground. Jedi fell into roles they had not chosen. Yoda arrived in a command ship, not as sage, but as general. No ceremony welcomed the Republic's hidden army. It moved without blessing. The war emerged not from votes or treaties, but from necessity. Dooku slipped into shadow before the first wave broke. He had summoned the Republic not for a stand, but to reveal the pieces already in motion. Geonosis was never meant to be held. It was the opening note to a song already composed. Below the surface, in steel corridors lit only by function, meetings took place that history would never record. Leaders of separatist systems gave their loyalty to Dooku, not for hope, but for advantage. They spoke of injustice, of disillusionment with the Republic, yet behind every word lay calculation. What they wanted was leverage. What they chose was fracture. On the battlefield, sabers clashed with metal. A Jedi fell. His blade struck the ground, shattering. The crystal inside dimmed and was lost to the sand. No one saw it vanish. His name was not remembered, but his silence joined the planet's growing stillness. Gunships lifted away, heavy with the wounded. Destroyers in orbit charted new jumps. The campaign had begun before anyone named it. What started as a rescue mission now spiraled outward into conquest. The Senate would retroactively authorize. It always did. War moved faster than legislation. In the temple, returning Jedi avoided meditation. Words came slower now. Something about the clones unsettled them. Their sameness, their unquestioning loyalty, the way they looked at Jedi with a calm that never blinked. The Force had stirred at Geonosis, but its message was not clear, only heavy. No monument marked the place. No anthem played when it was over. The dead were carried off, or left where they fell. The survivors were sent elsewhere. The Jedi had fought with valor, but in doing so they had crossed into something from which there was no return. Children would hear stories of Geonosis one day, not of victory, but of a threshold crossed. Though the planet held little strategic value, it carved itself into the Force like a scar, sharp, unhealed, unforgotten. Long after ships left the sky, a factory burned. Smoke rose into the red glare until it vanished. The sand shifted again, covering blades and armor. What remained beneath was silent. War had touched stars for the first time in a generation. It had come without fanfare. It would not leave quietly. The dust does not settle. It thickens into smoke. Rain drummed without pause, flattening waves that surged only to be broken again. Over the abyss, Camino stood like a memory sealed in glass, its spires pale against skies with no dawn, its foundations lost beneath restless ocean. The wind howled around metal bridges, but inside the facility, quiet ruled. Here, the Republic's army took shape, not in rallies or training fields, but in sterile corridors and endless growth chambers. In the cloning vats, life unfolded on a schedule. Embryos floated in nutrient tanks, curled in slumber. Beyond them, aging chambers lined the walls, rows of figures growing fast and evenly. Their faces were identical. Their bodies matured at double speed. They emerged ready to hold a rifle long before they'd learned to ask why. Kaminoans moved through the process with clinical grace. They charted development, monitored brainwave patterns, administered learning protocols. There was no pride, only calibration. They spoke in percentages, not names. Success was replication, error was waste. Yet identity refused to stay buried. Some clones began to call each other by names. CT-7567 became Rex. CC-2224 chose Cody. Numbers faded behind personality, behind color streaks painted on armor, scars worn like punctuation. In stolen moments between drills, they shared stories. Some laughed. Others trained harder. No one had taught them to bond, but they did. Jango Fett's presence lingered, though he visited only briefly. He trained the earliest clones himself, sharp, cold, exacting. His departure left a silence that echoed louder than his footsteps. The clones bore his face, but not his path. They were expected to fight, not to question. When the Jedi arrived, the army was already formed. Shark T remained longer than most. She observed them with attention, not detachment. While generals studied schematics and deployments, she listened. A few Jedi noticed something strange in the clone's eyes, not emptiness, but waiting. One clone, sleepless, stood before a viewport during night cycle. Rain smeared the glass. His reflection looked back, not as a product, but as a question. Somewhere inside, he wondered what lay beyond numbers, beyond mission parameters. No programming had given him that thought. It arrived on its own. At the edges of the facility, clones deemed defective were quietly removed. Behavioral flaws, physical inconsistencies. They vanished without announcement, returned to the sea that bore them. No names were recorded, no rites observed. Deployment orders arrived. The first battalions geared up for Geonosis. No music played, no ceremony marked the departure. They loaded into gunships, weapons in hand, unreadable behind visors. For every trooper that left, more waited. Storms never broke. Lightning etched the sky in brief white lines. The sea slammed the city's legs with the weight of a world. Inside, rows of soldiers stood ready. Their posture was perfect, their gazes forward. Each helmet bore the same face. Among them stood a boy, smaller than the rest. No number, no uniform, but a face identical to theirs. Boba Fett, untouched by genetic tampering, watched in silence. He wasn't bred for war, only raised beside it. They looked past him, unaware. He watched them go, and understood what they didn't. He was free to choose. They were not. Camino receded into rain. The gunships rose into clouds, headed for systems unknown. What awaited them were deserts, jungles, cities wrapped in ash. They would fight for worlds they'd never visit again. They would die on orders from voices they'd never see. Yet in the margins, between orders, between battles, something unprogrammed began to stir. Clones whispered in mess halls. They carved symbols into bulkheads. They told stories no Kaminoan had planted, no general had heard. Each voice was fragile, easily erased. Still, they persisted. They did not march for banners. They did not dream of medals. They marched for each other. From steel and silence, voices begin to rise. Mustafar did not rest. Its breath rose in fire and steam, spilling from cracks that pulsed like open veins. The ground churned beneath a sky soaked in red. Towering forges loomed above rivers of lava, their walls groaning with metal and pressure. Every corridor inside those foundries followed one rhythm, the pulse of production, constant and absolute. Conveyor belts glided across gantries, suspended above the heat. Mechanical limbs moved in seamless harmony, attaching heads, wiring limbs, sealing frames. Orders were not shouted. No supervisors paced the floor. Code dictated everything. Droids were born without thought, only function. Each unit was accounted for. Each number aligned with a contract. Every contract the result of corporate alignment. On Nemoidia, decisions were made in silence, pen strokes ratified by blinking signatures. Not dialogue. Executives behind blank masks reviewed shipping lanes and mineral allotments. Their concern was not justice, but consistency. Behind every factory stood profit. The Trade Federation watched projections more closely than battlefronts. The Techno-Union calibrated outputs down to the hour. The banking clan adjusted rates based on casualty reports. Losses could be replaced. Morale was irrelevant. Droids did not rebel. Dooku, once Jedi, now voice of the Confederacy, offered grand speeches to outer systems. His rhetoric promised sovereignty, but his methods forged dependency. Sectors already wounded by neglect found comfort in his clarity. The Republic's delays had cost them trust. His answers, though hollow, arrived faster. Those who believed in his cause thought they joined a revolution. In truth, they entered an algorithm. Their fleets were requisitioned, their systems integrated into supply lines. Protocols replaced governance. Assembly replaced negotiation. Deep within Mustafar's lowest vaults, rejected prototypes slumped in piles. Limbs twitched occasionally, residual code misfiring in broken joints. Some attempted to rise, their programming looping fragments of forgotten orders. None succeeded. They were reclaimed by fire without pause or grief. Orbiting command ships hovered above it all, relaying movements to battlefields across the stars. With a single transmission, legions could shift course. No strategy paused for mourning. If one offensive failed, another followed. Every maneuver aligned with spreadsheets. Efficiency dictated fate. Back on Nemoidia, the war's metrics were calculated by clerks and financiers. Victories brought no celebration, only adjustments to flowcharts. Mining operations expanded. New contracts triggered expansions. Laborers, bound by debt or chains, toiled without voice. A young Neimoidian once asked why so many perished. His elder replied flatly that war ends only when it stops returning dividends. There was no malice in the answer, only math. In conference, Dooku presented his allies with a new design, the Magna Guard. Not mass-produced yet, but promising, fast, quiet, deadly. Their movements echoed Jedi forms, recorded and refined. They were approved before the demonstration ended. The question asked was not whether they were ethical, but how quickly they could be built. Elsewhere, a single droid stood beneath a cooling vent, motionless. It raised its hand toward the rafters, paused, then dropped it. No command initiated the gesture. Its core rebooted. The machine resumed its task, the moment erased. These were not mistakes. They were anomalies without consequence. The war pressed forward. Droid transports landed on new worlds daily. Battle lines changed as dictated. Villages, cities, strongholds. Each target evaluated for value. Entire populations were conquered or ignored depending on the calculus. Those who witnessed the droid advance felt no malice from their enemy, no hatred behind the blasters, only the weight of inevitability. The war felt less like a storm, more like a system, impartial, unfeeling, precise. In chambers above Neimoidia's vaults, the council met once more. Hollow projectors displayed frontline changes. None commented on the dead. Their focus remained fixed on shipment schedules and armor upgrades. Between blinking lights and finalized reports, the separatist machine deepened its grip. Dooku knew it would not last forever. The corporations believed they were building permanence. He knew better. They were scaffolding for something else. He did not correct them. He only watched the gears turn faster. On Mustafar, the molten rivers flowed beneath unbroken rhythm. Inside droid skulls, gears spun without pause. From the depths of factories to the heights of financial towers, the war advanced without emotion. Beneath the surface, the machine never sleeps. The city of Christophsis glimmered beneath a shroud of ash and fractured crystal, its skyline jagged from artillery fire, its streets transformed into trenches. Towers once built for trade and diplomacy now held command posts and sniper nests. The Republic had arrived not with diplomats, but with divisions of troopers whose boots sank into ash where dialogue had once taken root. And the Jedi had followed, their role already changed. Master Obi-Wan Kenobi examined a flickering map of troop positions, his robes worn thin by smoke and grit. Anakin Skywalker moved nearby, restless in clone-issued armor. Neither had sought command. Both understood they could no longer refuse it. Jedi had once resolved disputes with presence alone. Their blades were meant for defense, not domination. But now they led battalions of identical soldiers, each bred to obey, each silent in the face of death. Across broken sky lanes and shattered buildings, the Jedi charged, not as emissaries, but as commanders. One trooper collapsed mid-advance, not from blaster fire, but error. No order had been disobeyed, no sign of sabotage. His helmet cracked open in the fall. Anakin paused only long enough to switch off the man's rifle, his face unreadable. No words were spoken. The Force, too, gave no answer. Elsewhere, Mace Windu transmitted new coordinates from the front. His decisions moved thousands. Behind his every command stood calculations weighed against lives. The Council, once methodical, now made decisions in hours. War left no room for patience. Padawans barely past adolescence took to gunships with sabers ignited and ranks assigned. Some had never seen a battlefield. Now they gave orders to men twice their age. In their eyes burned purpose, but not yet understanding. Luminara Unduli stood beside a wrecked tank after an assault, her fingers brushing scorched metal as though reading the memory of the machine. She lingered without speaking. When she returned to camp, she instructed her Padawan to repeat the Jedi code. The girl spoke the words clearly. The lesson was in the silence that followed. The Republic pushed through Christophis' central ridge with orbital support. Jedi led squads through shattered towers and collapsed bridges. Droids emerged from subterranean caches in waves. Orders flew. Lightsabers lit paths through smoke. 1,000 decisions demanded clarity where there was none. Obi-Wan advanced through the Crystal District, moving with the precision of one who had long ceased to hope for clean victories. Anakin flanked from below, his saber a blur of light and instinct, driving into the tunnels where resistance boiled like trapped steam. The maneuver was effective, necessary. When the smoke cleared, 27 clones had fallen. Their designations were recorded. Their replacements were already inbound. No memorial was raised. The Jedi reported their success to Coruscant through encrypted channels, voices flat with fatigue, their words shaped more by duty than conviction. They logged casualties with precise formality. They submitted after-action reports that blurred together with each passing day. But in private, a deeper unease took root. They had preserved territory, yet something vital had been lost beneath their boots. After one skirmish, Anakin stood beside a crater where a forward command post once stood. He lowered his blade into the mud, let it hum briefly, then deactivated it. No one retrieved the weapon. It remained, half buried, as others marched past. In the temple's shadowed halls, quiet replaced wisdom. Students practiced alone, repeating forms in chambers once alive with guidance, now haunted by silence. Archives held battle data, not ancient lore. Meditation rooms echoed with the breath of returning generals, not seekers of balance. Yoda sat high in the spire, watching the order change. The Jedi were honored, cheered, deployed across the stars. Yet behind their victories lay silence. And within that silence, the Force grew heavy. Its current no longer danced. It pulled. Command had a cost. With every directive issued, the Jedi stepped further from guardianship and closer to something unnamed. With every clone who followed, another soul was sealed into a future not their own. The galaxy still called them peacekeepers. Yet robes had given way to armor. Councils now read casualty charts. Crystals were selected not for wisdom, but reliability. On the plains of Christophis, a lightsaber lay beside its fallen wielder, forgotten. Rain pooled around the hilt. The mud crept over its form. No one reached down to lift it. Marching feet passed beside it, unaware, uncaring, driven forward by the only thing left: orders. A voice arrived in the midst of orders and engines. A girl, small but sure-footed, who spoke her name without apology. Anakin Skywalker stood beneath the war banners of Christophsis, marked by the soot of siege, and watched as Ahsoka Tano approached. She carried no doubt, no hesitation, and no knowledge yet of what war could erase. Obi-Wan offered a questioning glance. Skywalker said nothing. The temple had sent her. A decision made above them, beyond them, one that would not be undone. The girl was his, not to protect, but to lead. She was a Padawan, though no ceremony marked it. Within days, they deployed to Teth. The mission was direct: recover a hostage and return. But the jungle moon gave no room for clean orders. Separatists lined the cliffs with droid artillery embedded in the stone, fortifications clinging like claws. The monastery above them glared down like a forgotten shrine. Each step forward came at cost. Troopers advanced under fire. The incline narrowed with every meter. Blaster bolts sparked against rocks and armor. Ahsoka climbed behind Anakin, never lagging. Her saber work was raw, overreaching, her footwork unrefined. Yet she didn't fall behind. Where others sought cover, she pressed forward. When shells cracked the ridge, she didn't flinch. Anakin watched her, not with doubt, but caution. She fought on instinct, not yet discipline. But when danger flared, when a blast sent stone shards flying, she turned, grinned, and kept going. He didn't return the smile, but something began to shift. She didn't need saving. She needed sharpening. Inside the monastery, the air reeked of scorched metal. Columns once carved by monks now bore marks from blasters. The child they sought was locked deep in a reinforced cell, not injured, not mistreated, only hidden. Rescuing him wasn't about justice. It was about optics, the kind that could sway systems to the Republic cause. They moved without need for orders. Anakin took point. Ahsoka mirrored. They weren't in sync, but they found rhythm. Where she paused, he stepped. Where he faltered, she filled in. By the time they reached the cell, alarms had already called reinforcements. Retreat turned into survival. The descent was chaos. Gunships hovered too far to help. The ridge became a kill zone. Ahsoka moved like she had no other choice, and Anakin never let her drift too far. When a detonation broke the cliffside, she slipped, and he caught her. A hand wrapped around her wrist, a grip steadier than the rock beneath them. They didn't speak. The moment didn't require words. Later, after the child had been secured, after the ridge was left behind, they stood beside a wrecked transport, half buried in jungle mud. Ahsoka asked if she had passed. Her voice carried both pride and hesitation. Anakin turned toward her and said the war would be her only teacher. She didn't yet understand what that meant. Not fully. But the tone in his voice carried more than approval. It carried memory. On Coruscant, The temple walls offered none of the calm they once did. Jedi who had never led troops passed judgment on her with glances. She kept walking beside Anakin. He didn't explain her. Her presence beside him was enough. Obi-Wan asked how it went. Anakin shrugged. "She's still alive," he said. Ahsoka smiled. She'd begun to understand that was the only answer that ever mattered out there. Their bond would deepen. It would be tested. But on Teth, it began not with doctrine or training, but motion. Two figures pressing forward through fire and noise, no longer just master and student, but something more layered. He taught without realizing. She learned without asking. In dreams, she returned to the cliff's edge, replaying each leap. When Anakin dreamed, he didn't always see her face, but her voice, calling through smoke, remained. War would change them both, not by promotion or defeat, but by the quiet decisions made where no records were kept. Ahsoka had not arrived to challenge him. She came to share the weight. Her place for now was beside him. One day it would not be. The student follows closely, but paths always divide. In the Outer Rim, war bent every horizon. No campaign followed a straight path. Routes twisted around ambushes, stretched past broken comms, and faded into terrain too wild to map. The Republic pressed forward regardless, pushing into systems long forgotten, where names blurred and survival rarely mattered. Umbara, Felucia, Salokami. Each world demanded a different kind of fight. Each redefined what counted as progress. On Umbara, the sky never cleared. Light bled through poison mist in fractured beams. The land twisted perception, bending shadows and shifting distance. Umbarans moved like smoke, and their weapons pulsed in unnatural silence. Republic forces advanced blind. Soldiers fell to terrain as often as enemy fire. General Pong Krell issued commands from high positions, unmoved by losses. His doctrine demanded sacrifice. His tone left no room for dissent. Clones followed orders, but grew wary. Their whispers turned into warnings. When it was revealed that Krell had turned, few were shocked. They had already seen the signs. Betrayal had taken root long before the truth surfaced. On Felucia, the ground pulsed with dangerous life. Jungle spores floated on the air. Luminescent plants snapped shut without warning. Droid positions disappeared beneath fungal growth overnight, only to reappear elsewhere. The enemy buried tanks in vines and waited for the Republic to stumble into them. Aayla Secura led her forces through it all, calm, observant, measured. She offered orders with clarity, her presence grounding. But even she couldn't ease the war's toll. Clones fell into the undergrowth and vanished. Patrols ended without return. Each path led in circles. Even victories dissolved under the jungle's breath. Salokami offered no camouflage, only exhaustion. Its surface appeared barren, but beneath layers of ash and stone, separatists built droid factories that churned without rest. Republic forces dug in. Trenches spiraled outward from half-collapsed bases. Artillery pounded day and night. No high ground, no relief, just grinding attrition. Jedi passed between bunkers with weary eyes. No lessons remained, only instructions. Clones rotated shifts without rest. Medics treated the same wounds again and again. Spare parts ran low. Rations arrived late, but the orders continued. In one outpost, a single tree stood, barren, cracked, half buried in blast marks. When no cover remained, troopers huddled behind its trunk. Someone tied a torn Republic banner around it. Wind tugged at the fabric, but it never fell. Months passed. The flag stayed. Between skirmishes, clones marked the fallen with scratched numbers. Some wrote journals, brief fragments on scraps of plastoid. Others fell silent altogether, saving words for combat only. Even the droids slowed in the dust, their voices glitching, their targeting uncertain. The war was not linear. Victories looked like survival. Survival looked like delay. Retreat often circled into ambush. No hill stayed taken for long, and every step forward felt like one more into something unseen. Reports sent to Coruscant framed each siege as success. Maps updated, generals promoted, Jedi debriefed in clean robes. But the truth never made it back. No holomap captured what the sieges took, not just lives, but clarity. In the temple, war became chart work, sectors retaken, objectives secured. But as more Jedi returned, fewer believed in what had been gained. Some no longer recognized the order reflected in field reports. Fewer still trusted the victories they were told to celebrate. The Outer Rim sieges were never about conquest. They weren't about defense. Some whispered they were just distractions, bloodshed drawn far from the core, while something darker solidified at the center. On Umbara, smoke still curled through broken trenches. On Felucia, roots already covered the paths where bodies had lain. On Salukami, the flag still hung. A helmet rested at the tree's base, its visor darkened, number erased by sand. No statues would mark these places. No official record would name the sieges as turning points. But those who served remembered, not as warriors, not as victors, but as those who were ordered to endure without knowing why. Some Jedi paused before boarding the transports that would take them to their next assignment. A few looked back. Most didn't. The war offered no room for pause, only movement, only forward. Each victory feels more like surrender. They kept marching. From trench to jungle, starship to barracks, clone troopers followed orders. They deployed, regrouped, rotated, repeated. But beneath the polished routines, something subtle stirred. It didn't disrupt the war or challenge command. It asked quiet questions between battles. On the Rishi moon, a small listening post drifted at the edge of the known war. Its crew, a handful of clones, ran drills, spoke in code, laughed when they thought no one watched. They followed protocol without knowing why. Then the separatists struck, not with an army, but with precision sabotage. The outpost was supposed to fall unnoticed. Its silence would have let the enemy advance unseen. But the clones fought back. They called for help before the final blast. The station was lost, but its signal reached command. The enemy's path was exposed. The clones had held, not out of programming, but choice. Cody read the report. Rex said little, but the names, Echo, Fives, stuck. They weren't just designations anymore. On Camino, the vats remained full. New troopers emerged by the thousands. Instructors corrected anomalies. Kaminoans monitored growth charts, reinforced conformity. But questions from the front began drifting in through reassigned troops. Why had no one answered that distress call? Why had the intel failed again? Why did the Republic keep pushing where it couldn't hold? Answers came sharp. Orders are not to be questioned. But silence grew heavier than instruction. Fives, CT 5555, asked anyway. Not to defy, but to understand. He stayed late in the simulators, trained harder, read longer. He asked why Jedi sacrificed battalions for single objectives. What happened when the war ended? Where soldiers went when peace came? Most didn't answer. Some didn't know how. Clones lived for duty. But duty had begun to fracture. Not in disobedience, but in difference. A blue handprint across a chest plate. A kill count carved into a thigh guard. Phrases traded only between squads. Names carried from one rotation to the next. Reminders they weren't just units in armor. Camino's engineers didn't like it. Deviations were logged. Independence flagged. Discipline reinforced. Yet for every suppression, another trooper etched a symbol onto his armor. Not to rebel, just to remember. Shark T sensed it unfolding. She watched from high windows as troopers ran formation beneath the rain. Perfect lines, precise timing, but her eyes followed the ones whose steps fell slightly out of sync. She brought it up with the Prime Minister. He called it degradation. She called it growth. No statue marked the Rishi outpost, but names were recorded. Echo, Heavy, Fives. Names that meant something to those who passed through the training halls. Not because of medals, because of meaning. Across the front lines, battalions began to evolve. Squad jargon, painted visors, unofficial unit names. It wasn't revolt. It was memory. Identity emerged in the cracks of uniformity. Some Jedi encouraged it. Plo Koon walked among his troops like kin. Others, like Krell, enforced rigid command. There was no agreement among the Order. They had never led soldiers who felt. Fives kept asking. When his brothers died without clear cause. When medics pulled strange chips from their skulls. When reports were rewritten or erased. He followed trails that no one wanted found. What he uncovered wasn't just error. It was design. Buried deeper than orders. Older than the war. Loyalty had always been assumed. Bred into every clone. But now it had weight. It could no longer be automatic. It had to be chosen. Not with speeches, not with defiance, with small moments, pausing before executing a command that didn't make sense, shielding a brother who couldn't move, saving names others forgot. The factories on Camino still ran. The war still burned through stars and men. But inside the armor, questions grew louder. Some clones began to picture something after. A name unassigned, a home, a life not counted by missions flown or kills confirmed. They never stopped fighting. But now some fought with more than orders in mind. What is loyalty if it is grown in a vat? In forgotten places, allegiance was carved from suffering, where Republic orders could not reach, and clone protocol had no meaning. Another kind of loyalty thrived, born from pain, sealed with secrets, and ruled by masks that told no truth. On Lotho Minor, hidden beneath heaps of rusted machines and planetary waste, something that should have died refused to fade. A mind once cut in half simmered through agony. The body that crawled through filth had once carried the name Maul. Now it remembered only a fire and a name, Kenobi. Years had passed since his fall. The galaxy had buried him in myth. But hatred kept him breathing. Scrap became limbs. Madness became shape. He did not rebuild himself through healing. The dark side twisted his body and reformed his purpose. Savage Opris, his kin, pulled him from the wreckage of himself. Dathomir's roots, thick with Nightbrother blood and ancient spells, steadied his mind. He remembered his training. He remembered being cast aside. What rose from those ashes was not Sith, not anymore. It was something colder, a hunger no doctrine could contain. He did not seek to reclaim the Sith legacy. He forged a new dominion, silent, faceless, and far-reaching. Syndicates of crime bent beneath his command. Black Sun, the Pike Syndicate, Crimson Dawn, all drawn in by a promise of profit and threats carried through encrypted channels. At the center was a signal, a hollow mask, pulsing red over static, speaking in modulated tones. Behind it, Maul orchestrated strikes and vanishments. Supply lines shifted, officials disappeared. No ideology guided his rise, only leverage and precision. Mandalore became the fulcrum. Long divided between warriors and pacifists, it was vulnerable. Deathwatch, a militant remnant, sought to reclaim its violent traditions. Their leader, Pre Vizsla, allied with Maul out of ambition. But ambition is blind. In ritual combat, Vizsla fell. The Darksaber passed to Maul, along with the loyalty of those bound by its blade. His rule began not with speeches, but with order. Sundari fell into line. Credits flowed. Crime found safety beneath his rule. Even peace, briefly, took root. But it was peace without freedom. The city obeyed, but it did not kneel. Not all accepted him. Bo-Katan Kryze, sister to the deposed Duchess Satine, refused to serve. She gathered what forces remained loyal to Mandalore's ideals and disappeared into shadow. Her war had not ended. It had only changed shape. The Jedi sensed disturbance too late. Reports reached them, fragmented and incomplete. When Obi-Wan Kenobi arrived, Maul had already laid the trap. It wasn't battle Maul offered. It was punishment. Satine, bound, Maul, calm. There were no demands. Only the inevitable conclusion to an old wound. She died with Kenobi's name on her lips. Maul watched grief replace control. That was his aim. Not the death, but the hollowing. He struck not at flesh, but at belief. He wanted Kenobi to break the way he had been broken. Mandalore was only a stage. When the Jedi left, Maul did not linger. He slipped back into the web. The syndicates expanded, feeding on the Republic's distraction. Smugglers rerouted under his guidance. Senators vanished without trace. Kyber crystals changed hands in silence. Every move carried his fingerprint, though no name was ever spoken. The war offered cover. The Jedi, stretched thin, missed what rotted behind the lines. A hollow mask flickered in the depths of Coruscant. Another bounty, another disappearance. The rules bent, then shattered. Some Jedi spoke of a darkness they could not locate. Visions clouded. The Force trembled. Yoda said little, but in meditation, he sensed a scar that pulsed like an old wound reopened. Maul had no need for titles. Apprentice, Lord, Ruler. They were cast aside like names burned off a tomb. He was something else now, an echo wrapped in metal, feeding on pain, sustained not by the past, but by the failure of others to see what he had become. His revenge was not complete. It had taken root. The Force bends around wounds that never closed. A signal drifted from nowhere, drifting without origin, marked by no distress code, yet carrying a pull that could not be ignored. The Jedi cruiser shifted course without understanding why. No system claimed the region. No hyperspace path led to it. Still it waited. What emerged through the cloud seemed less a planet than a thought suspended in mist. Mortis shimmered with contradiction. Its surface shifted. Forests bloomed and vanished. Mountains collapsed and reformed. Time unfurled and rewound itself. The Force, unbound by form, lived in every stone and breath. Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Ahsoka Tano descended into its gravity well and passed into myth. 3 figures ruled here. The father, ancient and tired. The daughter, luminous. The son, burning with rage. They embodied balance not as principle, but as conflict. A living fracture suspended in tension. Mortis was not a place where truth was taught. It was a place where it demanded to be faced. They summoned Anakin, not as a diplomat or soldier, but as the chosen. The father called him Fulcrum, a bridge between opposites. Anakin stood at the center, a man built for war, now asked to restore what no longer wanted balance. Visions tore into him, his mother's face, Padmé's final breath, fire swallowing cities. Each scene arrived not as warning, but revelation. Mortis showed not what might be, but what already waited in time's corridor. Ahsoka wandered too close to the sun's reach. He spoke into her thoughts, reshaped her certainty. For a moment, she turned. The dark cloud touched her mind. Her blade flared against her friends. She fought not with anger, but confusion. The sun wanted more than corruption. He wanted proof that light could falter. The daughter intervened, radiant but fading. She pulled Ahsoka back, but the cost was hers alone. The sun's blade struck. Light gave way to shadow. The balance shivered. Mortis groaned. The great tree at its center fractured, its white limbs splintered, its bark blackening from within. Nature recoiled. The air dimmed. The father watched silently, knowing the end had begun. He turned again to Anakin. This place had always been a crucible, not a refuge. The prophecy weighed heavier here. The sun pressed deeper, showing Anakin his future. Galaxies in flames, Jedi temples broken, children screaming beneath a red blade. Anakin recoiled, but part of him listened. For a breath, he believed he could undo it all, that by ruling, he could preserve what mattered. The temptation was not shouted, it whispered. The father intervened. He stripped the vision from Anakin's mind, erased the knowledge before it rooted. The sun, enraged, fled into the clouds, screaming against the silence. The final battle came swiftly. No war, no grand arena, just belief colliding with loss. The father gave his life to strip his son of power. The son, now vulnerable, fell beneath Anakin's blade, not in anger, not in vengeance, in grim finality. The balance died with them. The tree stood half alive, one branch dark, one pale. Its roots still dug into divided ground, but it no longer moved. Its leaves no longer whispered. Mortis began to dissolve. Structures became smoke. Time knit itself again, slower, less certain. The three Jedi awoke on their cruiser. No logs recorded the detour. No damage was found. Yet something unseen lingered. Anakin walked the halls with a stillness too measured. Ahsoka spoke little, her eyes drawn to corners that did not move. Obi-Wan watched them both, unsettled by what remained unspoken. The Council never received a report. There were no coordinates to chart. The realm had vanished, but the echo had not. Mortis had shown them something they could not forget. A truth too large for memory, too quiet for words.
The Force now stirred differently around them, as if expectation had replaced prophecy, as if time now leaned forward to meet them.
In a system unnamed, a star flared slightly brighter. On a world untouched by war, wind stirred through unmarked valleys. Across the stars, the Force adjusted, subtle, waiting. The stars whisper things no mind can hold. On Mandalore, even silence seemed rehearsed. Sundari's domed capital shimmered beneath a clouded sky, its towers poised like answers to questions no one dared ask aloud. Transparent bridges floated between spires, designed not for war, but for grace. From above, the city gleamed. Beneath, the soil still remembered fire. Duchess Satine Kraz ruled not by decree, but by conviction. Her presence steadied a world that once tore itself apart in civil strife. In the lull that followed, she planted pacifism like seed in scorched earth. Mandalore, weary of graves, listened. Not all did. Death Watch remained in exile, biding their time on Concordia. They trained in secret, armor polished, oaths unforgotten. Satine knew of them. She chose not to strike first. It was her burden to hold to peace even when surrounded by ghosts of violence. Into this tension walked Maul. He came not with armies, but with leverage. Death Watch aligned with him, seduced by promise. Previsla fell in ritual combat. The Darksaber passed to Maul's hand. With it came Mandalore's throne. Satine's government fractured. The council, rattled by fear, failed to resist. In Almec, Maul found his mask, a puppet prime minister to offer illusion. Behind palace doors, he pulled strings. Curfews tightened. Allies vanished. Streets grew quiet. Satine was imprisoned in the tower she once ruled from. Her chambers stripped of dignity, her voice heard only by walls. She never begged. She did not recant her beliefs. Obi-Wan arrived without approval. He came as a man, not a Jedi. Disguised, he slipped past checkpoints to reach her. Their reunion carried the weight of unspoken memories. He tried to free her, nearly succeeded. But Maul had already set the trap. In the throne room, now a stage for cruelty, Satine knelt in chains. Maul waited, not for victory, but for fracture. Words passed like blades. Then the real one fell. She died in Obi-Wan's arms. Her breath faltered between sentences. Her final words were thanks, not fear. Maul said little. The silence was the point. Sundari did not stir. Patrols stayed in formation. Markets reopened. Life resumed its pattern, familiar but hollow. In a chamber once used for tea, a servant found a cup shattered where it had fallen. Satine's cup. The dust around it had gathered slowly, untouched by fire. No one cleaned it. No one moved it. Maul didn't remain to rule. Power bored him. He wanted wounds. Mandalore, having served its role, was left to decay. Death Watch fractured. Some remained loyal. Others, like Bo-Katan Kryze, turned away. Bo-Katan gathered loyalists beneath the surface, resisting with quiet tenacity. She did not speak of glory. Her victories were unseen, her weapons few. But resistance returned. The Jedi Council took no action. The war elsewhere eclipsed Mandalore's suffering. Reports thinned. Priorities shifted. The Republic saw strategy, not sorrow. Mandalore's flame flickered beneath a glass dome, visible but not yet urgent. Obi-Wan said nothing in his return. No report could carry the weight of her name. No words could speak what it cost to lose her. He carried it inward, where silence thickened. Peace, he had once told her, was worth any cost. She had believed him. Now, that phrase echoed differently. The cost had been exacted and paid in full. Peace is a dream too fragile to cradle. On Dathomir, peace had never been an option. The world moved in red mist, curling between thorned trees and jagged cliffs. Its rivers flowed black, thick with memory. Lightning split the sky without storms, born from rituals older than language. The force here did not guide or enlighten. It twisted and clung like roots beneath wet soil. The Night Sisters walked that soil as keepers of forgotten paths. Witches wrapped in dusk-colored robes moved in circles carved by bone and echo. Their power did not channel the force. It warped it. Each incantation was a thread of sorrow, each blade of power sharpened by grief. They did not seek peace. They lived by will. At their center stood Mother Talzin, not as monarch, but as force of nature. Her voice stirred the fog. Her anger shaped the air. She spoke to the dead and the world answered. The Jedi dismissed her as myth. The Sith remembered her with caution. Count Dooku once sought her alliance, and through it, savage Opress was born. A weapon sculpted through chant and dark knowledge, given strength without anchor. But the creation refused its master. Dooku retaliated without hesitation. The droid invasion arrived without warning. Blaster fire consumed the jungle. Flames rolled through villages. Night Sisters fell beneath metal feet. Flesh and spirit burned together. Talzin said no farewell. Her resistance was a whisper, not a war cry. Those who survived scattered. Some vanished into the wild, others into exile. Dathomir quieted. Its mists remained. But the voices were fewer. Where chants once rose beneath the moon, now only smoke twisted, slow, deliberate. In the smoke, for those who looked too long, faces flickered before dissolving into the sky. Talzin herself did not die, not fully. Her body faded, slipping between realms. What remained moved through firelight and shadow. Her strength found a vessel in Maul, not reborn as son, but repurposed as weapon. Maul returned to Dathomir in pieces. Talzin rebuilt him with incantation and resolve, binding hatred to form. He rose not as a Night Sister, but as the echo of one. He did not revive their order. He used their legacy to forge something colder. From syndicates and criminals, he shaped the Shadow Collective. Its power moved through spice routes and blood contracts. Beneath the surface of every deal lay a trace of Dathomir. Maul did not speak of it. He wore it. Relics of the Night Sisters began surfacing elsewhere. Carved stones warm to the touch, pendants with silent weight. scrolls inked in vanished tongues. Some Jedi catalogued them, most refused to touch them. Sith acolytes misused what they could not control. Talzin watched through it all, her presence carried in the places between breath and belief. A lone traveler once landed by accident. Red mist swallowed him. His last message ended mid-sentence. Static followed, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. No one searched for him. The system was flagged as unstable. During a campaign near the sector, Ahsoka's ship lost readings for an hour. Instruments dimmed, time stuttered. No alarms sounded, yet something was felt. When systems returned, the crew couldn't explain why their hands smelled of earth. Dathomir was left alone after that. Only Quinlan Vos had tried to make peace with the world. The Jedi who lived at the edge of rules entered its jungle once and came back changed. Stronger, perhaps, less certain. His report was sealed. Its contents never shared. Talzin's final stand came not through war, but spell. She reached across space, challenging General Grievous. The clash was swift. Her body fully returned to the physical, vulnerable at last. Blades met flesh. The force flared, then silenced. Smoke rose where she fell. No grave marked the place. Her name faded into wind. Still, the land did not forget. Beneath the surface, roots remained alive. On quiet nights, the jungle murmured with voices no longer visible. Travelers spoke of dreams that bled into waking. Some awoke with red dust in their mouths. The galaxy moved on, but Dathomir waited, not with hope, with memory, the kind that carves itself into stone and blood. Even ashes carry vengeance on the wind. But in places where air is thin and silence lingers behind sealed doors, vengeance gives way to endurance. Lola Sayu orbited a dying star, its skies lit by the glow of toxic gases and volcanic flame. Nothing grew on its surface. No civilization called it home. Only one structure clung to its terrain, a fortress carved into obsidian ridges and fused rock, built not to defend, but to contain. The Citadel, constructed in a forgotten war, the prison once held traitors, spies, and deserters. Then the Republic locked it away, hidden from the archives. Later, the Separatists rediscovered it, not as ruin, but as opportunity. They reactivated its walls, rewired its systems, and stocked it with droids made to suppress breath before it could become rebellion. Few returned from its cells. Inside, light came in flickers. Alarm panels blinked like failing hearts. Chains clattered in damp corridors untouched by time. The Citadel did not echo. It swallowed sound. Prisoners walked with heads lowered, not from defeat, but to hear the tread of patrols that marked the difference between routine and death. Among those confined was Even Piel, a Jedi Master captured while carrying vital hyperspace coordinates. His guards knew his value. His cell was sealed with triple fail-safes. Every hour, interrogators made their approach. Every hour, he said nothing. The Council authorized a rescue. Skywalker volunteered. Obi-Wan stood beside him. Captain Rex, familiar with the cost of tight corridors and ambush, led the clone detachment. Stealth units replaced standard gear. Sabers were drawn only as last resort. Entry came not through the front gates, but through a volcanic vent, choked by heat and smoke, where footing gave way without warning. They descended in silence. Inside, traps lay in wait. Blaster turrets hidden in walls. Droid sentries programmed to recognize pulse over uniform. Gravity locks that shifted floors without notice. The Citadel had been designed to break infiltration before it began. Every inch was a challenge. Every corridor a dare. They advanced not in formation, but in fragments. Skywalker took point. Obi-Wan held the flank. Echo, Fives and the rest moved through shadow and flame, marking turns with code glyphs only they could read. Every breath was earned. PL was found alive, barely. His body bore wounds no healing trance could undo. Yet his spirit, ragged and resolute, had not cracked. He passed half of the coordinates to Ahsoka, who had followed the team despite the Council's protests. The other half he still held, refusing to surrender it until escape became more than theory. The retreat turned siege. Droids swarmed from hangar levels. Command units deployed suppression gas. Traps once deactivated rearmed themselves, triggered by motion and heat. Doors sealed, paths closed. The fortress, sensing intrusion, reshaped itself into a cage. One clone fell in a choke point, caught by a turret before cover could be found. Another dragged a wounded comrade beneath sparking conduits. None cried out. Only their footsteps told the story, echoing unevenly as the group pushed forward. PL collapsed midway through the ascent. His breath came sharp. His words fractured. He gave the rest of the data to Ahsoka, forcing it into her hands before strength fled his grip. He did not ask to be left. He commanded it. And then, beneath the flicker of dying lights, his cell finally opened, not to freedom, but to a breath spent in purpose. They carried his body until the drop point neared. Outside, the extraction ship hovered just above the ridge. Wind from its engines scattered ash and dust across the mountaintop. Fives, helmet cracked, signaled coordinates through static. A narrow bridge collapsed behind them. Time narrowed to moments. A final push. The survivors boarded with weapons raised, cutting down pursuit droids before the last ramp sealed. The ship rose, slicing through atmosphere already scorched by the planet's breath. Below, the Citadel remained, intact, silent, unchanged. In the medbay, Ahsoka sat without speaking. Her armor bore the handprint of someone now gone. The data they recovered would change Republic strategy. Lives would be saved, worlds secured. But the cost remained, heavy and sharp. Skywalker stood alone by the viewport, watching Lola Sayu fade behind the ship. His hand clenched at his side. The mission had succeeded, yet he felt no triumph. Obi-Wan, ever measured, offered no comfort. There were no words fit for what had been left behind. Later, in a quiet corner of the temple archives, A clerk filed the operation under classified intelligence. The name Citadel became a string of numbers. The report bore redactions in every section. No mention of PL's sacrifice. No record of the route through the lava vent. No acknowledgement of the clone who closed the door behind them before fire claimed the hall. But the survivors remembered. A rusted cell door remained open in their thoughts, its hinges still warm from a life given freely. Some walls fall through siege, others yield only when someone stops breathing. Some walls fall only when blood is spent. And others remain standing long after they should have crumbled. CT-5385, called Tup by his brothers, stood beneath a pale sky above the Ringo Vinda ring station. The battle around him echoed with the familiar rhythm. Orders shouted, blaster fire trading arcs, the hum of air transports circling above. His helmet remained steady. His steps matched his squad's. Then something fractured. He turned toward the Jedi general leading their advance, without hesitation, without expression. His blaster fired once. The Jedi collapsed without a word. Silence followed, deep and immediate. Tup did not flee. He did not resist. His hands trembled as the weapon fell from his grip. Sweat marked his brow. Words came in fragments, murmurs of orders he could not name, dreams he could not dismiss. His eyes, usually sharp with purpose, looked hollow. The clones around him acted quickly. The body was retrieved. Tup was sedated. The transmission to Coruscant arrived within the hour. Camino ordered his return. Medical staff in Tipoca City received him without fanfare. The Kaminoans spoke in clipped tones. Their examination protocols tightened. The term defective passed through their discussions with sterile clarity. No diagnosis was shared with the Jedi. No theory offered to his squad mates. Fives demanded answers. The brother he knew had not faltered. Something had taken hold. Something unnatural. Permission to investigate was granted reluctantly. The war made concessions when questions couldn't be ignored. Fives observed the scans, saw the seizures, noted the tremors that pulsed through Tup's muscles without cause. The Kaminoans dismissed them as degradation, side effects of accelerated aging. But the clone medic AZI-3 disagreed. Pattern irregularities pointed to something deeper. Together they operated. Buried beneath brain tissue, wrapped in layers of bio-coded protection, they uncovered it. A foreign object. Thin, organic, laced with encryption signatures no clone was meant to access. The inhibitor chip. Fives stared at the fragment in the containment tray, blood still drying along its edge. It did not look like control. It looked like betrayal. The Kaminoans moved quickly. The lab was sealed. AZI-3 was restricted. Fives placed under review. The chip was removed, but the cause already moved beyond recovery. Tup died shortly after. No final words, only a flat line beneath surgical lights. Fives refused silence. He escaped Camino with the sample, seeking the one voice left who might listen, Chancellor Palpatine. Arriving on Coruscant, he bypassed Senate protocols, contacting Jedi channels through encrypted bursts. Each message carried urgency, not fear. The truth had been found. It could not be buried again. But truth, left in shadows too long, grows twisted. Palpatine welcomed him in private chambers. No guards, no droids. Only the highest office of the Republic and the man who stood at its heart. Their conversation was never recorded. No transcript survived. But Fives did not return unchanged. He ran, hunted through lower Coruscant, hunted not for what he had done, but for what he knew. Reports framed him as unstable. Hints of conspiracy seeded in official statements. Surveillance footage blurred. Motives rewritten. Fives made it as far as a loading dock near the industrial sectors. Cornered, disarmed. Rex found him there, weapon holstered, face unreadable. Fives tried to explain. The Chancellor, the chip, Tup's death, the control hidden inside them all. Words tumbled over one another, desperation trailing every breath. He spoke of a plan buried beneath loyalty, of a fate they were never told. His voice cracked. His hands bled from a fall during the chase. Blaster fire rang out. His body slumped to the floor. The clone who pulled the trigger followed orders. He believed he was stopping a threat. He never learned the details. The report called it tragic. The Senate mourned quietly. A cracked datapad was recovered later, tucked inside a discarded satchel. It displayed CT-5385. The file opened to a voice memo never sent. Fives, speaking into static, telling his brothers to watch, to question, to remember. The datapad was stored in a restricted archive, its contents sealed. The Jedi requested further inquiry. Kaminoan representatives stood before the Senate committee and delivered rehearsed statements. Accelerated aging, genetic anomalies, emotional fracture due to prolonged exposure to combat. The explanation satisfied those who wanted closure, not clarity. The clones who served with Fives said less. Rex altered his mission logs. Echo, recovered months later from separatist hands, asked once about what had happened. The conversation ended in silence. Tup's chip was labeled an isolated malfunction. The procedure to detect future anomalies was approved. But the system remained in place. The others still carried them. None were told. And somewhere beneath the surface of Coruscant, a chamber remained locked. Within it, the architect of the war reviewed reports with a steady hand. The pieces moved as expected. The sacrifice had not gone unnoticed. It had simply been absorbed. Not all enemies wear a different face. Not all weapons lie dormant. Some truths do not reveal themselves by force. They claw from the shadows, unseen, unheeded. Truth claws from the shadows, unseen, unheeded. But some do not wait for truth to surface. Some speak it aloud, again and again, until their voices fray. Padme Amidala walked the marble halls of the Senate, draped not in armor, but in resolve. Her presence, poised and deliberate, moved between closed-door councils and chamber debates, like a wind no window could keep out. War changed everyone, but not all in the same way. While the galaxy counted battles and victories, she counted costs no one else would name. Coruscant pulsed with urgency. Traffic lanes glowed red with overrun patrols. Security checkpoints multiplied. The war effort consumed every department. Emergency measures flowed from the Chancellor's office like rainfall, each one justified by a new threat. Senators who once spoke with caution now rallied behind legislation they barely read. Fear moved faster than reason. Padme resisted not with protest, but with presence. She met with delegations from the Mid-Rim, listening to families who hadn't seen relief in months. She drafted amendments meant to protect planetary neutrality. She held long dialogues in small committee rooms, arguing for oversight, for restraint, for laws that outlasted the fear shaping them. Few listened. Bail Organa joined her often. Mon Mothma sat nearby, gaze firm, notes precise. Together, they represented a thread too thin to be called a movement. Yet they persisted, not because they expected to win, but because surrendering the argument felt like surrendering the Republic itself. In chambers high above the temple's shadow, Padme spoke against military expansion, against the use of cloned lives without representation. She raised concerns about trade embargoes bleeding outer systems dry. Her words echoed through the dome, poised and unwavering. The applause came seldom. Eyes avoided hers more often than not. She watched her colleagues drift. Some vanished from public sessions entirely, their names whispered in connection to secret councils. Others changed in subtler ways, tone, posture, voting patterns that no longer aligned with their earlier convictions. The war demanded alignment. It rewarded silence. Behind her public work, private battles unfolded. She met in quiet alcoves with those displaced by policy. Senators who feared to speak in open session found refuge in her office. She used her title not as a shield, but as a door. The conversations that passed across her desk were not about speeches. They were about survival. Amid it all, she returned home each night to a secret life. Anakin met her in darkness, always under threat of discovery. Their words were brief. Time slipped between deployments and Senate hearings. Still, they found each other, on balconies, behind locked doors, beneath the silence of lights dimmed too early. He spoke less now. His eyes held distance. The war weighed on him differently. She sensed the shift, subtle but growing. Each time he left, he carried more than weapons. He carried something inside her couldn't reach. She said nothing of her fear. He said nothing of his dreams. When she learned of Fives and the discovery buried on Camino, she requested the files through official channels. The request was denied. She tried again. Denied. The story, once whispered in corners of the medical council, faded into redacted paragraphs and archived silence. She took meetings with Jedi who seemed troubled. Some spoke of the Chancellor's expanding reach. Others did not name it directly, but their concerns mirrored her own. Still, no one acted. The Order, stretched thin and tangled in battles far from Coruscant, had lost the clarity it once carried. Its presence in the capital felt ceremonial. One evening, she stood by her garden window, staring at a blossom once gifted by Naboo's delegation. Its petals had curled despite the controlled environment. The chamber was sealed, its conditions unchanged. Yet the flower had withered. She made no move to replace it. Palpatine summoned her twice that month. The conversations, masked in kindness, always pressed the same theme: unity, loyalty, efficiency. He asked for her support in measures framed as temporary. She answered with measured resistance, polite but unwavering. After each visit, she returned to her quarters unsettled, not by threat, but by certainty. He never raised his voice, never argued. He simply spoke as though the war had already decided what the Republic needed to become. One morning, her voice failed during a session. It wasn't illness. No exhaustion weighed her limbs. What halted her was the quiet realization that her words were falling into air too thick to carry meaning. Still, she stood. Still, she spoke. A flame kept lit not by outcome, but by principle. No rebellion had been declared, no turning point marked. But something was closing, slowly, quietly. The Republic she defended now bore too many resemblances to the thing she once opposed. She knew it, and still she stayed. She would not abandon what was right, even if it no longer listened. Her voice echoes, but the walls grow thicker. Yoda sat still for long hours beneath the high columns of the Jedi Temple. But it was not the affairs of the Senate that preoccupied him. A presence brushed against his thoughts like a memory not yet lived. Something older than doctrine, older than the Republic. This feeling did not speak with words. It stirred in the silences between them. While war devoured systems and strategies consumed minds, Yoda listened to the thing that moved beneath it all, patient and unspoken. His ship descended into the clouds of Dagobah with no escort and no announcement. The swamp offered no welcome, only quiet. Damp air clung to the folds of his robes. Roots coiled through the earth as if to guard the heart of the planet. He walked slowly, not because of age, but because of reverence. The force thickened around him. It didn't guide, it waited. In the hollow of a twisted tree, he found the cave. The air grew colder as he stepped inside. Shadows clung to the walls, and the space stretched longer than its size allowed. What greeted him was not a creature or a voice, but a version of himself cloaked in darkness. It spoke nothing, yet it revealed everything. In that space, Yoda saw what fear could shape him into, what control might justify. He stood before his own downfall, unflinching, not because he dismissed it, but because he recognized how easily it might become real. The vision faded without struggle. Dagobah was not the end. The next step appeared in the stillness of meditation, when the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn returned, not as an apparition, but as something felt. That voice pointed to another place, one that didn't exist on charts. Traveling there required no hyperlane, only surrender. He emerged into a realm untouched by time, greeted by beings who wore no consistent shape. The Force priestesses, drifted like thoughts given form, their faces shifting between serenity, sorrow, and wisdom. They offered truth, but not comfort. To continue beyond death, Yoda would need to shed the self that feared endings. His title, his history, his pride, none could pass through. They gave him trials. One showed him the Jedi as tyrants, cloaked in the language of peace. Another brought him face to face with attachment, loss, and the temptation to change fate through force. These illusions weren't tests of strength. They asked whether he understood what it meant to let go. The final challenge waited on Moraband, the ancient world of the Sith. Its dust fell like the memory of screams. Statues of long-dead lords loomed over tombs that whispered only to those who listened too long. As he moved through the ruins, a figure emerged. It wore the likeness of Sifo Dyas, then of Bane, then of something darker. It offered power, not to destroy, but to prevent destruction. It promised safety if he would seize control. He stood still. No blade left his belt. No words left his mouth. He met the Phantom's gaze, not with defiance, but with understanding. The illusion unraveled, unable to anchor itself in someone who no longer grasped for control. The Sith could not tempt him because he no longer needed to win. He returned from the journey without ceremony. No Jedi asked where he had gone. The war had grown louder in his absence, but the path he now followed moved in another direction entirely. He no longer pressed for victory. He began to watch the cracks that no one else would name. He saw what was coming not as punishment, but as consequence. The Force had shown him what must be preserved, even when everything else was lost. The Jedi had mistaken survival for purpose. He would not make that mistake again. Quietly, he began laying down the path others would follow later. Not a plan of battle, but a thread of hope. The kind that does not flicker, even when it is hidden. When he closed his eyes in meditation, he no longer sought calm. He entered communion. He had touched something beyond war, beyond time. In exile, he would carry this with him, unseen by those who counted the Jedi as gone. He knew better. Someday, a student would come to him, not from the temple, not trained in the old ways. This student would arrive broken, unready, unshaped. But he would listen, and through that listening, the future could begin again. What Yoda preserved could not be taught through curriculum or decree. It lived in silence, in humility, in trust. The light he carried now was not meant to flare like a weapon. It burned low, steady, and without end. Light does not always come from stars. Sometimes it disappears inside the walls meant to shelter it. The Jedi Temple still stood, high above the towers of Coruscant, its great spires reaching like fingers toward a sky that no longer listened. Inside its stone and silence, Anakin Skywalker paced corridors that had grown narrower with time. Once, he had walked these halls in awe. Now, he moved through them like a stranger. The Order had raised him, trained him, called him brother. Yet with every cycle of war, something sacred thinned. Compassion had become strategy. Meditation had turned into command briefings. The code was recited in the same breath that called for reinforcements. He began to question whether the Jedi he served were still the ones who had once rescued him. The council chamber felt colder each time he stood before it. Eyes that once offered guidance now measured him. Mace Windu's voice carried a weight that pressed more than it supported. Even Master Yoda, so often a source of stillness, looked at him now with distance rather than understanding. Anakin was no longer a Padawan. He was their weapon, honed and ready, but not trusted. He never asked for more than truth. What he received were half sentences wrapped in caution. They tasked him with difficult missions, trusted him to lead armies, yet withheld their confidence. When they finally offered him a seat on the council, it came not as honor, but as a test. One laden with mistrust, veiled behind formality. They placed him there, not as a master, but as a spy. They asked him to observe the Chancellor. Anakin had saved Palpatine's life more times than he could count. In the man's chambers, he found moments of calm and certainty the Jedi Temple no longer offered. While the Order clung to rigid detachment, the Chancellor listened, advised, even praised. It was subtle, almost tender, this shaping of trust, but it worked. Anakin believed it because at his core, he wanted to believe someone saw him clearly. Padme watched him with concern. She asked quiet questions in shadowed rooms. He gave quiet answers, but the unease lingered in his voice. He had seen too much death, heard too many screams twisted by war. Yet the council demanded he see more, fight more, kill more, and now betray one who had stood beside him as the Republic burned. In the meditation chambers, he tried to still his mind, but the silence was no longer friendly. Visions stirred. Padme, pale and fading, his arms empty, the temple in flames. Every future he reached toward twisted at the edges. The Force, once a companion, now felt like an ocean with no shore. He visited the archives late at night, not for history, not for answers, just to remember. Rows of ancient texts and star maps lined the walls, untouched by war. He wondered how many Jedi had once believed they were building something eternal, only to watch it decay from within. He traced his fingers over the edges of a holocron, but never opened it. In his quarters, his robes lay folded beside the cloak he had begun to wear beneath them. It was darker than regulation, almost black. He told himself it offered warmth. In truth, it felt more honest. His choices had begun to pull him away from light, not by force, but by accumulation. One step, then another, until returning seemed more painful than moving forward. A memory rose, his mother's grave on Tatooine. He had sworn then to never let loss happen again. That vow had shaped him more than any lesson in the temple. It had not been approved. It had not been Jedi, but it had been true. Every teaching that told him to let go clashed with the part of him that refused to lose another loved one to fate. Palpatine began to speak more openly. He questioned the Order's integrity, their blind loyalty to war, their political entanglements. Anakin didn't refute him. He listened. Not because he believed in everything said, but because no one else was saying it aloud. The Jedi had become generals, yet expected to remain untainted. They dictated peace through violence. He saw hypocrisy in every decision cloaked in serenity. One day he stood at the temple gates and looked up at its highest tower. The sun struck its tip, casting a perfect shadow down the stairs. He did not enter. Instead, he returned to the Senate building. There, in a room lined with red, Palpatine waited. The conversation that followed would begin slowly. Not with betrayal, not with confession, but with understanding. The Chancellor would speak of power, not as conquest, but as necessity. Anakin would not resist, not because he was deceived, but because he had already begun to drift. The betrayal of the Order was not a fall, it was a release. One robe remained neatly folded on his bed. The other lay draped over the chair, its darkness quiet and full of meaning. The fire begins with the one who has lost his name. While the Jedi Temple remained steeped in debate, the streets of Sundari burned. Smoke coiled through the glass domes of the Mandalorian capital, catching in every shattered window and shattered oath. Below its elegant towers, troopers fought not for conquest, but to hold together something already unraveling. Ahsoka Tano had returned, not as a Jedi, not as an officer, simply as one who still chose to care. She stood beside Captain Rex, no longer bound by rank, but by trust. Between them hung a silence formed from years of battle and belief, frayed now by doubt, but not broken. This war had been her inheritance, unwanted yet familiar. Mandalore was its final act, sharp, swift, and strangely personal. The Republic had sent troops to neutralize Maul and reclaim the capital. But Ahsoka knew that this conflict went deeper than strategy. Maul did not desire control. He wanted chaos, fracture, the shattering of faith itself. The battle moved beneath the domes and through the alleys. Clone troopers in blue-striped armor engaged Maul's loyalists, many of whom had once fought for pacifism and were now draped in crimson. The familiar clash of blasters filled the air, but something colder moved beneath the noise. Every hallway felt haunted, every room staged for something larger than the war itself. Ahsoka moved quickly. Her sabers shimmered like reflections in floodlight, not meant to kill, only to cut paths forward. She did not fight for orders. She fought to protect those who still had something to return to. In the shadowed lower levels of the city, Maul waited. His presence bent the Force like heat bends air. When they finally stood before each other, the room seemed to narrow. He offered no pretense, no feint, only questions. He spoke of Sidious, of Anakin, of the fall already unfolding beyond these walls. His voice rose not with rage, but with certainty, as though speaking to someone who already knew she'd been abandoned. Ahsoka refused his offer to join him, not because she trusted the Jedi, she no longer did, but because Maul's path led only deeper into ruin. He saw the future clearly, but had chosen to survive it by becoming part of its violence. She would not do the same. Their duel lit the throne room in brief flashes. Sparks fell like rain. His strikes came swift and brutal. Hers, precise and unrelenting. It was not a contest for victory. It was a test of who would bend first. As the battle tipped, glass shattered above them. Light broke through the ceiling, and with it, the illusion of isolation. She disarmed him at the edge of a steel girder high above the city floor. He dangled, furious and afraid. When she extended her hand, he screamed warnings rather than pleas. The future was already lost, he said. Darth Sidious had already won. The words struck harder than any blade. She knew he believed them. Troopers took him away in binders, not with triumph. With the grim understanding that even captured, Maul had set fire to something no water could put out. The siege of Mandalore was ending, but the real war had moved elsewhere. Ahsoka stepped out into the daylight. The city stood wounded, but intact. Republic banners fluttered beside Mandalorian symbols blackened by fire. Rex stood waiting, helmet tucked under one arm, eyes narrowed. There was no celebration, only breath, and the knowledge that something irreversible had just occurred. Transmission reports came in fragmented. Rumors of Jedi death, confusion in the Outer Rim, silence from Coruscant. The sound of triumph dulled beneath the weight of unfinished truths. Ahsoka found herself alone in the quiet that followed. She gazed out at the city and felt no victory, only the shape of something vast collapsing just outside her reach. That night, she walked the upper corridors of the command ship, preparing to leave Mandalore behind. She passed clone troopers at attention, saluting a commander who no longer wore rank. They still looked to her, not for orders, but for meaning. She said nothing. Words would not hold against what was coming. In her quarters, she sat beside her sabers. They had been a gift, a gesture of returned trust. She stared at them, then looked away. Elsewhere, a signal was preparing to be sent. It would not carry orders. It would end them. In the last quiet moment before the sky changed color, she felt the Force shiver. A ripple from the heart of the galaxy. Not pain, not fear. A folding of the world itself. Outside the ship, stars turned slowly above the wounded planet. Time seemed to pause. In the last echo of war, destiny speaks. The command came without thunder, without fire, without a face to deliver it. It moved through comms and implants, encoded in simplicity. Execute Order 66. In less than a breath, war shifted its mask. Soldiers turned. Sabers flared for the last time. The Jedi had trained them, fought beside them, named them brothers. Across trenches, on jungle floors, in narrow temple halls, trust collapsed in an instant. Blaster fire replaced loyalty. What had taken lifetimes to build unraveled with clinical precision. On the bridge of a cruiser above Felucia, Aayla Secura walked ahead of her squad. Their formation did not change. No warning, no hesitation. The first shots struck her back. She did not lift her blade. The jungle absorbed her silence. In the caverns of Salukami, Oporanchisis fell with a roar that never reached the surface. Ki Adi Mundi's final stand came in the snow, a blue blade raised against a dozen rifles. No one remembered his words. The wind took them before the dust had settled. At the temple on Coruscant, the betrayal took its most brutal shape. The march came at dusk, framed by the golden light of the planet's endless skyline. A black figure led the clones up the steps, once a student, now an instrument. Inside, younglings gathered in the archives, waiting for guidance. What met them was a blade and the emptiness behind it. Elsewhere, some Jedi sensed the shift in the Force and moved before the trap closed. Obi-Wan, wounded and falling, plunged into the waters below Utapau's cliffs. Master Kakruk vanished into the outer rim, armor scorched and robes torn. Some escaped, most did not. Yoda paused on Kashyyyk as the trees fell silent. His hand rose not in defense, but in mourning. 2 clone commanders flanked him, rifles lifting. Before they fired, he turned. The Force did not scream. It withdrew. In its stillness, he moved with clarity. And when he fled the planet's canopy, he did so without triumph. Ships burned across the sky. Halls that once rang with lessons and laughter now rang with nothing. Statues cracked. Holocrons flickered. Lightsabers dimmed beside their keepers. The temple's heart, long considered unshakable, was left open to shadow. The Republic did not mourn them. Across the Senate floor, Palpatine declared the Jedi traitors to the Republic. His voice, sharpened and amplified, wrapped itself around every broadcast. Footage played without context. Words were twisted. The people cheered. They had watched their protectors lead armies. They had seen Jedi sit in seats of power and walk the halls of war. When told they had turned, many believed it without question. Their robes had looked too close to authority. Their silence had grown too distant. Bail Organa arrived too late. Smoke poured from the temple gates. He was turned away by clones, their helmets unmoved by his title. But from a high balcony, he saw a small child try to flee. Blaster fire struck. The child did not rise. Bail left with his ship heavy and his silence heavier. The purge moved outward. Dantooine, Ilum, Deveron, Jeddah. The names blurred into ash. Some Jedi destroyed their lightsabers, hoping anonymity would offer peace. Others refused to run and met their end standing. A few lived long enough to wonder whether survival was a kind of betrayal. In the archives, holocrons lay shattered, some by blaster fire, some by choice. Knowledge sealed for generations, scattered in broken shards across stone floors. The Force remained, but its voice quieted. It recoiled from the slaughter, waiting for hearts that could hear it again. Among the few who escaped, grief replaced structure. Masters had no Padawans. Temples had no walls. Titles lost meaning. They fled not as warriors, but as ghosts. Rex stood on a distant cruiser, helmet in hand, orders fighting memory. Ahsoka beside him, no longer Jedi, no longer soldier, just someone still breathing. They did not speak of victory, only of what must be buried and what must never be forgotten. The Order had not fallen in a single day. Its fall began long before, in debates, in doubt, in the slow erosion of listening. But on this day, its death was complete. Across worlds, stars continued to rise and fall. Life went on beneath banners newly sown. But in corners of the galaxy, where once the Force was tended, silence settled like dust on ancient stone. A chapter ended not with ceremony, but with absence. 1,000 lights had gone out, and no one remained to name each one. Silence falls across stars once guarded. The war ended not with peace, but with silence so vast it felt like vacuum. Where once engines roared and lightsabers cut across firelit skies, now only whispers moved. The Clone Wars, long and brutal, collapsed into memory before the last flames cooled. On a nameless moon orbiting Mandalore, the snow drifted without purpose. It blanketed scorched fields, where cities had once stood proud. Beneath that snow lay remnants of armor, fractured droids, and a helmet half buried, its visor facing nothing, its purpose long ended. Ahsoka stood on that moon in quiet farewell. Around her lay graves no one had marked. The clones who died in that final pursuit had followed her, even after the command to turn. She had felt their hesitation, their struggle against the storm within. Some resisted, some failed, none were forgotten. Captain Rex had buried their bodies with care. The two of them carved no names, left no record. To the Empire now rising, these men had ceased to exist. But in this place, far from broadcast and tribunal, their loyalty was remembered in full. They did not speak of the Order. The word itself had become a wound. Ahsoka no longer called herself Jedi. Yet what lived inside her, discernment, compassion, clarity, remained unchanged. She had been shaped by the Jedi, but not confined by them. In the end, it was not the title that gave meaning, but the choice to protect even when there was nothing left to gain. The Republic, once spoken of in reverent tones, had vanished almost overnight. In its place stood the Empire, declared necessary by voices too tired to resist. The clone troopers became an occupying force. The Senate remained, hollowed of dissent. The people, still weary from war, looked upward and accepted quiet over justice. What remained of the Jedi scattered. Those who lived kept moving, hunted not for crime, but for remembrance. To be a Jedi was no longer an identity, it was a sentence. Rex changed his armor, removed insignias, cut ties. He no longer wore rank or gave commands. Yet in the core of him, something remained, a devotion not to orders, but to those he had stood beside. He no longer followed a code. He followed the memory. They separated without ceremony. Ahsoka took a freighter bound for nothing. Rex remained behind, blending into forgotten places. Neither said farewell. The moment had no room for endings. Elsewhere, remnants stirred. Maul vanished into the cracks of the galaxy. Palpatine crowned himself emperor. Darth Vader stepped forward as his shadow. The former Anakin Skywalker did not speak of his past. Whatever guilt survived was buried beneath a mask of fire and machine. Jedi temples stood abandoned or burned. Archives smoldered. Holocrons, once guarded as sacred, now cracked beneath marching boots. In time, the Force itself began to feel distant, as if waiting. But memory did not vanish. In the outer rim, stories began to spread, of travelers with strange abilities, of protectors who moved unseen, of a light still flickering even in the darkest systems. These tales were scattered, believed only by the desperate, but they endured. The Clone Wars had begun as a conflict between systems, but it had always been something deeper. It was a test of truth against deception, trust against manipulation, and in its final hours, it revealed its true shape. Not a war of heroes and villains, but of choices made under pressure, identities tested without warning. The galaxy turned. New laws were written. Dissent was silenced. Holonets repeated names of enemies already dead. The stars above Mandalore continued to burn, cold and uncaring. Ahsoka left the moon with her sabers buried deep in the snow. She walked away unarmed, not because she had given up, but because she no longer needed to prove what she was. Her survival was not a rebellion. It was a quiet refusal to vanish. As her ship disappeared into the stars, snow continued to fall over the empty battlefield. The helmet, still half buried, collected a thin layer of frost. No trumpet marked the end of the Clone Wars. No parade followed the final order. What remained were fragments of identity, of loyalty, of silence. In those fragments, something old had ended, and something else had begun. From these cold ashes, another shadow rises.